Thank you for joining us for this seminar. My name is Alexey Zakharov. I'm a fellow with the Strategic Studies program at Observer Research Foundation. And today we're going to discuss Russia-China relations. The past week was full of summitary fanfare with different events, the SCO summit in Tianjin, the military parade in Beijing, a set of important bilateral meetings, such as the Prime Minister Modi's and President Putin's meetings with President Xi Jinping. So today we are going to focus on Russia-China relations and its broader implications for different parts of the world. And we have a stellar panel with us of experts who I'm sure will help us to unpack the interpretations, intricacies, scope, and limits of the Russia-China partnership. And without further ado, let me start by asking Dr. Kireeva. Dr. Anna Kireeva is an associate professor with the Department of Asian and African Studies and senior research fellow at MGIMO University. So, Dr. Kireeva, I would like to ask you to bring us more light on the main takeaways from the recent summit and talks between President Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping. What were the major agreements reached? And if I could go into specifics, into the energy cooperation between Russia and China, what can we make out of some particular memorandum or quote-unquote legally binding memorandum on Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline, which I think an important item on bilateral agenda. Please, the floor is yours.
It's really great to see many familiar faces and great to be with you today. This visit brought very unexpectedly, really major results. Of course, major results are mostly about the natural gas contracts. Except for that, I think also another major result, which is of course regional in nature, has been the agreement during the SCO summit to initiate SCO Development Bank. But it should be noted that to a large extent, it's also Russia's decision because China had wanted to initiate this bank for more than a decade, but it was mostly Russia who was not really happy with this initiative. But we can see that Russia has withdrawn its opposition to that and has also decided to initiate the development of this bank. So I think it's also a bilateral decision apart from being a regional one and a multilateral one. Of course, major takeaways of the visit are about the gas contracts. As Alexey, you have just mentioned, we have this legally binding memorandum on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which is a very interesting name of phrasing it, because we are not really sure what is in this memorandum and what is not. So it's more about commitment, but not so much about the specific terms and obligations yet. So if we try to unpack it, what does it mean? This contract is very important for the Russian side. It is important for Gazprom, because it will be the gas from Yamal gas field, which used to be exported to Europe through Nord Stream project pipeline, which does not operate any longer. So it was a huge challenge for Gazprom because it had just either to converse this gas field or to agree with China on the Power of Siberia 2. And also we have heard that there will be two more smaller deals. I think it should also be put into context. Russia and China have agreed on increasing the volume of already existing gas pipelines. Power of Siberia 1 will have additional 6 billion cubic meters per year of exports, and Far Eastern Road, which is planned to start operating from 2027, will be also expanded from 10 to 12 billion cubic meters. So all in all, if we take 15 cubic billion meters projected over the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, it will amount to more than 106 to be correct, billion cubic meters, which actually is very important for Russia because it mostly, well, at least for the most part, will help Gazprom to compensate for the loss of the European market due to sanctions. And we have seen a very difficult negotiations. We had actual expectations that Power of Siberia 2 pipeline could be signed last year or the year before, but the negotiations apparently had stalled. And if we ask why, two, well, major issues emerged: the price and the volume. There were differences on that. The two sides agreed, that is what we know about this memorandum, on the supply of 50 billion of cubic meters, which was the Russian proposal, not the Chinese one, because the Chinese wanted smaller amounts, like 30 or 35 billion cubic meters of natural gas. But the price issue is very tricky because China wanted the price similar to Russia's domestic price, and Russia wanted to have a larger price because Gazprom needed to compensate for the construction costs. So we still are not sure. Another issues which we can see are not really figured out is who is going to finance the project. Will Gazprom have enough money itself to finance it? That's an open mark question. And also, who is going to be the contractor? Because Gazprom insisted that it wants to be the contractor, it wants to build the pipeline, to operate the pipeline, so that only it could influence the price. How close is the contract itself on the price? This is not really clear. There have been different opinions of energy experts. Most experts believe that it is reasonably close. Otherwise, the sides would not have announced this memorandum, wouldn't have signed it, maybe next year. But some other experts are more skeptical. So what issues are remaining? Why some experts are still skeptical? The price issue, the financing, and the contractor part. CEO of Gazprom, Alexei Miller, said that price is going to be lower than the one that Russia used to export natural gas to Europe because logistics is shorter. That's why it is going to be lower. But how much lower? It's not really clear at this time. And will there be take or pay obligations that Gazprom usually has in its export contracts? We're not also sure about this. Construction is estimated to cost about $14 billion. This is a huge sum of money. And for Russia, because of its current economic situation, it's not really sure that Gazprom can actually finance it all by itself. So it might need external financing. There have been some hints at that. We can speculate why now, why we have seen some progress now. And most experts point that geopolitical tensions surrounding the Middle East, especially between Israel and Iran, and also deepening trade war between the US and China, no consensus reached between Beijing and Washington, have contributed to more difficult perception of energy security in Beijing. So it decided that it needs to have some routes of natural gas imports that cannot be controlled by the US, and thus jumping in here. However, we do still have difficulties because energy experts are not sure that China, Northeast China, needs so much amount of gas, 50 billion cubic meters. So even sometimes experts speculate that it might not fully draw all this import volumes in future, which will be difficult for Gazprom. And also some energy experts have more critical assessment, meaning that China has more bargaining power and can actually delay the final binding supply contract. And just in case, it has an option to tap into gas supplies at discounted prices, while Russia has already committed to this project. At the same time, generally, I think it is important to highlight that Russia and China have demonstrated their intentions, and this decision will surely shape energy markets for years to come. And especially LNG projects might be much more difficult to implement. I guess that's about the whole picture here.
Thank you, Dr. Kirillova, for such a comprehensive overview of the results of the recent summits, and particularly for going into specifics with the gas contract. There are many unknowns still, but I think you managed to unpack many uncertainties. And you mentioned some of the external factors influencing Russia-China cooperation, such as US-China trade war. So with that, I would like to take the question to the Ambassador Mira Shankar. Ambassador previously served in the US and Germany, was Indian ambassador to the United States and Germany. So I would like to ask you, given your diplomatic experience, could you please share your perspective on the US approach? I mean, I know many of you are influenced by recent news and by the magnitude of the US President Donald Trump, his verbal interventions. That's why we can't skip this question. Particularly the US administration's zigzagging approaches towards India, China, Russia. What could be, according to you, the possible explanation of the recent measure by the US president to single out India for its energy cooperation with Russia, but at the same time following a more measured, a more careful approach when it comes to China? And if I may, a brief follow-up question also related to this. Have the recent engagements by Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the SCO summit have been instrumental in delivering a message to the US administration? Because judging by the recent statements from the Donald Trump's social media, it seems that he's offering some sort of an olive branch to India now.
Firstly, let me say that the Trump administration has not spelt out its policies towards Russia or China at any great length or with any substantive policy. But the Biden administration, in its national security strategy, had identified Russia as an immediate threat, which the US would take steps to constrain politically, economically, and militarily. It had identified China as the one country with both the intention and increasingly the capability to challenge the US globally. It had not sought action to contain China, but said it would compete with China and outcompete it in these strategically important areas, but it would handle this competition responsibly, trying to stabilize the relationship. So increasing strategic competition, but a desire to avoid an inadvertent military conflict with China. So the Biden administration had begun talks with China to try to stabilize the relationship. President Trump, during his campaign, basically promised an extremely tough approach towards China on trade and economic issues. This was supported by his MAGA constituency, which believed that the US had not benefited from globalization, that manufacturing had been moved overseas, US workers had lost jobs, and that this had also exerted a downward pressure on US wages, because if the workers sought higher wages, the company could just say, well, we'll shift production overseas because this is not competitive, you know, the kind of wages you're demanding. So the MAGA constituency and the US working class in general had supported a protectionist approach in the US to make the US great again. When he came to power, Trump imposed a tariff of 145% all told on Chinese exports to the US. So he began on a very tough note, as promised during his campaign. But there were two factors, I think, which prevailed on the US to moderate its stance towards China. One was that China brought its dominance over critical minerals and rare earths into play and used it as leverage by restricting exports of these critical minerals, rare earths, etc., which were very crucial to many manufacturing chains within the US, including renewable energy, electric vehicles, semiconductors, defense equipment. So there's a whole range of industries and manufacturing in the US which would get impacted if that restriction continues on a long-term basis. So the US then walked back its tariffs on China, and today there's an interim arrangement with 30% tariffs on China, China imposing 10% tariff on the US. And in the meanwhile, negotiations continue to find some trade deal. A grace period has been given, and the period of negotiation has been extended till November. This was one of the factors, but I think the other factor was that the US is dependent for so many consumer goods imports from China and President Trump had also promised to bring down inflation, which was seen as a major reason for Trump's success in the election, because inflation under President Biden had been a major cause of concern in the US. President Trump, I think, also walked that back on account of this, because it could have ramped up inflation in the US if there was a very rapid rise in tariffs on Chinese goods imports. I think at the moment, the US veers between finding a via media on the trade issue with China and, putting pressure on China, between accommodation and sharpening competition. And I think this also reflects conflicting constituencies within the US. On the one hand, you have the MAGA constituency, very protectionist and basically believing that the trade with China has knocked the bottom out of US manufacturing and that the US needs to focus on how to rebuild its capacities in this sector. And on the other hand, institutional Washington or institutional America, which actually sees a more interdependent relationship with China. In fact, at one stage, the Financial Times had called this relationship the financial balance of terror, and basically described China and US as two sumo wrestlers clinched in a wrestling clinch, and neither can go down without taking the other with it. So at one level, there is a kind of symbiotic interdependence, though efforts have been made not to decouple, but to de-risk by looking at alternative sources of supply, reducing over-dependence on China, as was very visible during the COVID pandemic, when many supply chains got disrupted. So there is an effort by the Western world to create a China plus one strategy. They found that they cannot decouple from China, at least without hurting themselves in too short a period or abruptly, and therefore de-risking is the preferred strategy. And you're seeing this in play. With regard to Russia, again, I think the Trump administration is veering between two approaches. President Trump had promised that he would end the war in Ukraine have a ceasefire within 24 hours, and had prioritized negotiations with Russia basically taking a view that if the US is able to improve relations with Russia, it kind of strengthens the US bargaining position in the US-China-Russia triangle. But I think two factors here. One is that President Trump has not been able, even during his first term, to provide a convincing intellectual framework for his instinctive approach to be more constructive towards Russia. The second is that because of this, institutional Washington and Europe particularly have not been prepared to go along with President Trump with regard to this approach towards Russia. So you can see these contradictory pulls and pressures. On the one hand, President Trump would like to pursue the negotiations with Russia. In Alaska, he agreed that there need not be a ceasefire first before peace talks, and said that peace talks could continue. Some interlocutors have basically said that they could, American interlocutors, that they could accept the Crimea being part of Russia, de jure as well as de facto, and the other 4 provinces which Russia has annexed, that it could be on an as-is, where-is basis, a de facto kind of ceasefire line, while negotiations continue to find a peace settlement. The Russian position has been that they would like to have a peace deal because to find a final solution, because in the absence of that, the war will continue, because there are efforts to arm Ukraine, and the whole situation will continue to be extremely volatile. Also, the whole issue of security guarantees is another question which remains. So one is, what are the territories which are going to be accepted as part of Russia? What are the territories which will be with Ukraine? Will there be a ceasefire line or a peace agreement? Ukraine and the Europeans say you can't have a peace negotiations without a ceasefire first. And the third element would be the security guarantees, because European leaders have basically said that they are willing to provide security guarantees, that they will come to the aid of Ukraine in the event of any Russian attempted incursion in future. And they are also willing to send troops to Ukraine for this purpose. For Russia, this is unacceptable, because they say that the whole conflict started because no heed was given to their concern that NATO enlargement should not proceed into Ukraine, and that Ukrainian neutrality should be guaranteed. So these are the 3 issues, really, which the peace negotiations will have to grapple with. It's not proving as easy as President Trump had thought the negotiations would. And so there is pressure on President Trump to step up pressure on Russia. Lindsey Graham has a bill in the Congress basically to impose secondary sanctions on countries which import fuel and other fossil fuel like gas from Russia. Some analysts believe that this bill was moved at President Trump's behest to give him some leverage in terms of pushing Russia or Russia's partners. And finally, I think the decision was to impose 25% tariffs, additional tariffs on India for importing Russian oil. Now, to India, this has appeared both unreasonable and unfair, because it doesn't apply to China, which is the largest importer of Russian fossil fuel. It doesn't apply to Europe, which imported more from Russia, $67 billion worth of goods, I think, from Russia in 2024, more than India imported, including India's fossil fuel imports. And China imported, I think, $10 billion more of Russian oil last year in 2024 than India did. So it really doesn't make sense. Some speculation has been that this has been occasioned by the fact that India is seen as a more manageable target than China, where negotiations on a trade deal could get impacted if sanctions, broad sanctions are imposed or additional tariffs are imposed. And on Russia itself, the additional sanctions have not been applied because I think President Trump wants to keep the space for negotiations. So from India's point of view, this is a somewhat cynical approach and betrays, a lack of appreciation of A, the actual situation, and B, the fact that the previous US administration had green-lighted, if you will, India's imports of fossil fuel from Russia. India's response has been that we will import fuel from whoever gives us the best deal because we pay for it in hard currency. We are not taking aid. We are not taking credit. So this is something that it is our sovereign right to decide. And indeed, as I said, the hypocrisy is that in Ukraine, the Europeans say Ukraine should have the right to decide whether it wants to be part of NATO or not. All countries should have the right to decide, but obviously it doesn't apply where US foreign policy or European foreign policy interests come into conflict with this principle. As far as India is concerned, we have responded to this pressure from the US in a restrained manner. Our approach is no confrontation with the United States, but no capitulation. And we will continue to keep engaged at various levels, but clearly this has led to an erosion of trust, and both countries will have to make efforts to see how they find a way forward.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think I have to intervene just to bring up other speakers to the discussion.
Sorry.
Actually, you mentioned many important points, and thank you for an in-depth analysis of the realignments in all these bilateral dyads and trilaterals. You mentioned strategic competition between US and China, and I would like to bring Dr. Alan Chong to the discussion. I hope you can hear us. And I would like to move on from the trade and economic aspect to Russia-China engagement in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the form of their defense and security cooperation. I think over the past years we have seen more consistency and more regularity of Russian and Chinese joint naval and air patrols. And it seems to be partially a response to the US national security strategy and to US-led security architecture, security arrangements in the region. So what according to you, are the broader implications of this engagement for the Indo-Pacific? And do you think there is a limit to Russia-China alignment in the strategic spheres? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you to all in the room for having me on this session. First of all, you have to understand that pre-invasion of Ukraine, that is an important marker when you're talking about impacts of Russia-China alignment for the rest of the Indo-Pacific. You have to understand that China was feeling somewhat, surrounded by the activities of these so-called minilateral security organizations, such as the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which India is part of, as well as AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, because these were seen as important instruments unilaterally created to encircle China. So the idea of Russia-China military exercises, I think, tweaks the dynamics slightly in the sense that China suddenly says, I have a Russia card to play. So if you surround me with these potential collective defense arrangements, or rather collective security arrangements, let me rephrase that carefully. I'm going to try to defy this potential Cold War logic by demonstrating to you that I still have good standing with Russia. And I think, what Xi Jinping said in Shanghai, at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, refers to the outdated nature of Cold War mentalities. It's a constant refrain of President Xi's foreign policy. It's a pointed jab at these arrangements that China does not wish to be encircled strategically, militarily, and so on. Has this got any impact on the rest of the Indo-Pacific? Yes, the rest of the Indo-Pacific is worried. And we've gotten used to the fact that rivalry between the United States and China can be managed. Russia was never taken seriously as a part of the equation until I think the Ukraine war broke out. And it looked like Russia needed China as an ally to provide it with supplies, because this is emerging to be one of Russia's largest military interventions in its near abroad. And potentially, if you start counting, the scale of damage, the drawdown of, military assets, it's definitely draining Russia's economy, notwithstanding, statements from Moscow and so on. And of course, the whole idea of Russia invoking historical reasons and ideological reasons for crossing the border into Ukraine with a large invasion force will disturb most of the Asian states, because you have to understand that the peace in the Indo-Pacific, and here I emphasize the East Asian part of the Indo-Pacific, has been predicated on the idea that you do not use force against a neighbor. If you have a dispute, you freeze it indefinitely and go around it. And we talk about things like comprehensive security, cooperative security, etc. And I think, the Ukraine operation has cast a very long shadow over China's standing with the rest of the Indo-Pacific. Is China legitimizing an invasion by one large state against a smaller neighbor? Okay, I leave that hanging there.
Thank you. Let me, on this note, let me bring an Indian angle. And actually, I forgot to mention the designation by Dr. Lan Chong. He is a senior fellow with the Center for Multilateral Studies at within the S. Rajaratnam International Studies School, Nanyang Technological University. He's based in Singapore. I'm sorry for that. And let me bring in our in-house expert China fellow with the Strategic Studies program at ORF, Kalpit Mankikar. Kalpit, I would like to pose a question on Indian view. On the Indian view of the trajectory, the recent trajectory of Russia-China partnership. There is it seems that there is much apprehension in India regarding 2 points. First is the pace of Russia-China engagement in the defense sphere, particularly Russia supplying China with the state-of-the-art weapon systems. And secondly, Russia's potentially shifting its posture, its stance towards some geopolitical matters that are sensitive to Indian interests. So how deeply rooted are these apprehensions within Indian strategic community? And do you think that India still should be worried with Russia-China partnership?
There is definitely a kind of a spectra looming over, the China-Russia nexus and its implications for India. So even since the start of the Ukraine war, we have been hearing this, particularly from Western commentators. Now, to provide you a perspective, I'd like to quote some of the Chinese scholars who've written on this, who have dealt extensively on this topic. Now, Chinese strategic in the Chinese strategic sphere, there is a different kind of a connotation about the India-Russia partnership. Now, one is Chinese strategists note that there is a great deal of political and strategic convergence between India and China. Now, they specifically cite two instances. One is during the G20 summit, when India had the tourism summit, which was held in Kashmir. China boycotted it, but at the same time, Russia sent a very high-profile representation to this summit. The other is, the S-400 deliveries have been as scheduled. And also that, even at the height of, our border standoff with China, the defense cooperation, particularly the fourth generation tank, there was a great deal of cooperation on that. Now, this is something which a lot of Chinese analysts have cited as, Russia definitely veering more towards India than with China. The other is, Chinese strategists have made this, what is their strategic outlook towards Russia-China? Chinese strategic outlook is that this is a marriage of convenience. These are their own words. Whereas it says that, with the India-China partnership, there is no border dispute. There is no issue of disputed boundaries. The other is there is no hatred between the two. There is no history of hatred.
China.
You
said India.
India, Russia. And the fact that they are natural allies. So this is what the Chinese strategic outlook towards the India-Russian partnership is. So I leave it to you.
Thank you for bringing not only an Indian but also a Chinese perspective on this relationship. So before we open the floor for Q&A, I would like to make one more round of questions to our speakers, but I will request them to keep their remarks as concise as possible because we are running out of time. So I will get back to Dr. Kireva. Anna, in his remarks, I think that Alan referred to the Chinese support to Russia in this difficult period of for the Russian economy. So how would you assess the trajectory of Russia-China bilateral economic cooperation, particularly given the widespread argument that Russia's economic over-reliance on China is growing? So according to you, how reasonable are these arguments? And if you could share, what progress has Moscow managed to make in diversifying its partnership as part of its new attempt to pivot to Asia?
Thank you so much for the question. That's a very complicated question. I will probably make several bullet points, and if there are questions further on, I will be happy to dwell on them more. So if we look at the trajectory of economic relations, I think we should highlight several major trends which we have seen since 2022. Of course, there is expanded trade. However, the last year's figures show that it has more or less reached the plateau, so $244 billion trade, but probably not so much any longer to increase it by, unless, of course, or until the power of Siberia 2 comes into operation. So from where do these figures actually have come? We have seen Russia reorienting its hydrocarbon exports to China. Mostly Russia has managed to do it in oil and coal, and together with India, China and India, Russia managed to fully reorient its supplies and basically compensate for the loss of the European market. I think this is a very remarkable and important issue here for Russia because the revenues from the export of fossil fuels account for about 1/3 of Russia's state budget. So the figure has been growing less and less, but still it is 1/3. It's a very large figure. Here, for example, China accounted last year for about 45 to 50% of Russia's oil exports, while India accounted for another 40%. So this is really a large figure. Also the same with coal, but here China's positions have been more. For natural gas and LNG, Russia managed only to partly fund alternatives in the Chinese market. And as I mentioned before, here the power of Siberia too is really critical for compensating for the loss of the European market. So this is one thing super important for the Russian government. Also, China managed to procure resources at discounted prices, which helped it also to recover from COVID-19 pandemics, and I think it can apply to every country buying Russian fossil fuels. There has been also increase in agricultural exports, but probably what also matters, another second major trend, is that China has emerged as the key supplier of everything more or less high-tech and sophisticated machinery, equipment, electronics, consumer goods, automobiles. And Chinese business has been really very quick to fill in the niches that had been vacated by the West and also by Japan and even partially by South Korea. Also, I should say that Chinese companies are gaining enormous profits for that. And what we have seen, a new development, is Chinese automobile companies coming as investors into Russia. So they have built assembly shops, the companies such as Haval, Chery, and Geely. And Chinese, especially the automobile market, is very important because here Chinese cars simply dominate the sales in the last 3 years of the new cars. Also, just as to highlight, Russia has been able to complete the Arctic LNG-2 project with the use of Chinese equipment instead of the Western and Japanese one. So here, really, it has kind of provided a lifeline for the Russian economy. Also, we have seen that the payment have shifted from using dollar and euro to mostly yuan and, well, basically national currencies. However, several issues remain, and we have seen, I should say, probably not over-reliance, but more like asymmetry growing here. There is a trend towards greater dependence of Russia on trade with China, and especially on importing, transferring of technologies from China. And of course, what really matters is how much Russia manages to diversify its economic ties with the other states, non-Western states. But just to highlight few issues which have emerged in Russia-China economic relations, aside from growing asymmetry in favor of China, I should also say that many Chinese large companies, Chinese corporations, they have actually been very cautious towards operating in the Russian market. And even many experts know that there has been basically over-compliance in the behavior of many Chinese banks, most of Chinese banks and companies. And there have been huge issues with payments since April last year. And also, just to provide an example, such companies as Huawei, they have started operating in the Russian market because of the threat of secondary sanctions from the US. So large companies, which are not state-owned enterprises, which are not hydrocarbon companies, they are very cautious about entering the Russian market. That's why what we have not seen, I don't know, more joint ventures or more production manufacturing apart from automobiles assembly shops. But even with automobiles assembly shops, this is a great development, but this is mostly just very, very small added value, small value added here in Russia. So most of the parts come from China. And we still have not really seen, for example, Russia participating in the value chains created by Chinese companies. So the relations have become much more, much stronger. The economies are more intertwined, but still the relationship is rather asymmetric and not really balanced here. And especially, I think the greatest challenge about over-reliance or over-dependence in future will be technologies, because apart from China, it is very difficult for Russia to find technological alternatives to the goods and technologies that China can produce. For example, for 5G technologies, mobile networks, Russia simply does not have other alternatives here. And Russia's policy basically has been to develop its own national domestic industry and import substitution policies, and at the same time diversify economic relations with the global south, or how the official Russian narrative calls it, world majority. So here I think we have India and Southeast Asia and the Middle East as priority partners, which Russia and Russian business look to with new opportunities, with creating new added value chains, new production networks, and new logistic links. So here, I guess, India is number one. It has really risen in importance for the Russian business. However, there is, well, it's completely another topic for a debate, and there are issues with business not very much understanding what are the potential areas for cooperation. But I can assure you that there is a great interest of the Russian business in coming into India. The problem is that many countries that do have technologies, these technologies are not indigenously made technologies. So many of the states are still either US allies or partners, and the technologies in this or that way still have US input. So in this way, Russia cannot obtain it even from the countries which are neutral or friendly towards it. So again, there have been a lot of attempts to diversify. That Central Asia also is very important for Russia in this context, because this is the region where many alternative shipment come from. But at the same time, it depends on whether Russia's partners are willing to create new production networks with the participation of the Russian companies. I think this is the key issue for future.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for being precise with figures and concise in your remarks. Dr. Chong, you are based in Singapore. I would like to hear your perspective on Russia-China growing partnership. How is it perceived in Southeast Asia? Is it a partnership of opportunities for Southeast Asian countries, or there are some risks for them? And a follow-up question is, interestingly, we have seen a very significant representation from ASEAN countries at the SCO summit in Tianjin. So do you expect more impetus for SCO ASEAN cooperation, or could some ASEAN countries explore to elevate their status and engagement with SCO in the future?
The first question, Russia-China alignment, that is certainly worrisome, because the whole premise of peace in the East Asian side of the Indo-Pacific is that we avoid the use of force, and we avoid aligning with great powers that resort to force to solve border disputes. Most of Southeast Asia, including Singapore, have adhered to this thing called a one China policy in relation to probably the most urgent flashpoint for conflict, for conventional conflict in East Asia. That is the Taiwan issue. And I think the wish of the majority of states along China's periphery is that China should not resort to a Ukraine-type operation to retake Taiwan. And of course, you might say, what about the Korean Peninsula? I think the Korean Peninsula, despite saber rattling by Pyongyang, it's mostly contained and reasonably peaceful. And the way multilateralism has been set up and operated in the East Asian side of the Indo-Pacific is a way of damping any possibility of hot wars appearing out of nowhere. And I think the Russia-China so-called increasing alignment is worrisome. But again, as your esteemed speaker, Professor Kireyeva pointed out, there are limits. Russia is running into a situation of extreme dependence on Chinese technology supplies and so on. And I don't think that is a happy situation that Russia wants to be in for a long time. I suspect at some point President Putin might consider, as part of a grand solution to the Ukraine issue, unfreeze relations with the United States. Because I think extreme dependence on China is worrisome. And there are reports, and as some of your esteemed colleagues in the room will also be aware of, that Russian intelligence is extremely wary of Chinese informal penetration into Russia's economy. If you look at the numbers of so-called Chinese long-term workers and visitors in the Vladivostok region and regions around it, it seems like there is a growing Chinese community in that part of Russia. On top of that, the idea of Chinese tourists taking an interest in visiting Russia more and more, it's both plus and minus. Plus in the sense that Russia earns hard currency and so on, but on the other hand, it means that China could be penetrating Russia's economy in very unprecedented ways, sometimes channeling in a very unfiltered way Russia's propaganda about the reasons, the background of the Ukraine invasion. And this comes straight through Chinese media, including the Global Times, into Southeast Asia. And people who do not make an attempt to get a more informed view by reading several different newspapers may just take what comes out of China's state-controlled media as the only truth. So that's worrying. Now, coming back to your second question of the part about Southeast Asia, I think Southeast Asians are generally pushed towards China more and more because of Trump's policies. And I think Ambassador Jaishankar very nicely pointed out, this Trump 2.0 administration is terribly domestic, oriented. It's probably worse than Trump 1.0. And one wonders, if President Trump shows up at the upcoming, APEC summit in November, is he going to stir, Asia's diplomatic relations in a very negative way? I mean, we have our ways of doing things, and we've already seen how his defense secretary, made remarks that basically, discomforted most of the East Asian states, because he said, you should up your defense expenditure to 5%, and 5% from perhaps 1% or less than 1% is a whopping amount. How can we afford that? I mean, objectively, you look at most developing Asian economies like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. 5% means you have to cut down on the bread. Using the analogy of the traditional guns versus butter, or bread and butter versus guns debate. So these kinds of militant messages, fall flat in much of the Indo-Pacific. Why should we be planning for a war in the Indo-Pacific? So I think the Trump administration is somewhat misguided, and as Ambassador Jaishankar nicely pointed out, is distracted, and I'm worried that President Trump himself is not getting good advice from whatever's left of his foreign policy advisors. And he relies on his friends who are business people. And business people are not necessarily the best judges of foreign policy, interests. So that's the worry. And okay, if you want me to drill down to why the Malaysian and Indonesian leaders were there, I suspect it's because President Prabowo of Indonesia is already admitted to BRICS, and he needs to, show a certain level of solidarity with President Xi and Prime Minister Modi as well as President Putin, like it or not, because Indonesia also has faced its share of decolonization-related border conflicts, and I'm sure it must be extremely uncomfortable for him to be there, standing next to President Putin. But that's part of BRICS. Malaysia is advancing its candidacy to join the BRICS as well, so I think it's also part and parcel of the same logic of diplomatic wooing and getting used to the fact that we need a buffer for as long as Trump is in the White House. The United States cannot be veritably relied on to supply the public goods and to keep its market access open. And some of you who are oriented towards the latest economic turbulence coming out of Washington is that most of the East Asian economies have temporarily stopped shipments to the United States because there was this loophole called in trade parlance the de minimis exception, where goods that are individually packaged to be less than US $800 can proceed under the pre-Trump rules. Now that loophole has been closed, and even here in Singapore, the post office has informed us, ordinary people, do not send anything to the United States until we clarify what are the taxes that have to be paid upfront from the Asian side before anything can even fly to the United States. And great trading nations like India, Japan, and even South Korea, they're all across the board freezing shipments to the United States for the coming week or so until we get clarity on what kinds of taxes need to be paid upfront before these things can cross the ocean.
Okay, thank you. I think we should mention one more region that was already actually mentioned by some previous speakers. And I would like to address this question to Ambassador Shankar. What about the European approach to China and to China-Russia relations? It seems that there is some duality in how Europeans approach China. On the one hand, there is much criticism on different matters, including on the Chinese support for the Russian economy and Chinese military support to Russia in its war in Ukraine. On the other hand, when it comes to action, I think that the European Union and many European capitals have been quite cautious. So how do you read this duality of approach?
I would agree with you that the European Union has been very cautious with regard to China. They're critical of China's support for Russia, but especially with regard to Ukraine. But I think they want to also keep open their economic relationship with China, because China is seen as a big market for the countries which are export-oriented economies, particularly Germany, France too. Now, if you see the latest, the UK new business secretary, the first visit he's making is to China to try to re-establish economic linkages or build economic linkages. So Europe has been a reluctant to fall in line with regard to US policy on China, even under President Biden, but they did do so to some extent. I think with President Trump's lack of clarity on policy towards China, this would get further impetus, because if the US is itself going to do a deal with China, then Europe is hardly likely to be persuaded to get tough on China.
Okay. Thank you so much. And Kalpit, a very brief question. We have seen the images of three leaders, Prime Minister Modi, President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin together, and I think that generated a lot of news in the media. And the question is, do you think, from an Indian perspective, do you think that the trilateral RIC, Russia, India, China format should be revived. Does it serve Indian interests?
So I think in the interest of time, I'll just be very brief. Alexei, firstly, I think we need to understand that the existing forums like BRICS and SCO itself give India enough leeway to and room to maneuver and also interact with the Russian and Chinese leaderships. So I think optics aside, because there has been a lot of optics, particularly related to one photograph. So I don't think the entire Indian policy establishment would want to move forward on that. So.
Thank you. I think we can open the floor for Q&A. We have around 15 minutes for that. Before we do so, please introduce yourself, identify the speakers, and preferably keep your questions brief and sharp. And yeah, I can see the question there.
Thank you for the insightful discussion. I'm Shresh Sharma, a student of International Relations, and my question is directed towards Professor Kireva. As Central Asia was considered and is still considered by some to be a place of Russia's influence, but due to Russia being busy in Ukraine, there has been skepticism about China making deeper inroads into the region. Do you see any sourness developing or any tensions developing in Russia-China relations with regards to Central Asia, or will they just carry on with the business as usual? Thank you.
Let's make a round of questions and then we will give the floor to speakers. Yes, please. You can use this mic for the question.
Thank you for all your speeches. My question is directed towards Professor Seong. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a doctoral researcher at JNU. My name is Saranya. My question is towards Professor Seong. I wanted to ask, you mentioned many friction points between Russia and China because it's not a completely rosy picture. What are your thoughts about Russian reception of China's Arctic ambitions? Thank you.
Thank you. There is one more question. Tushar.
Thank you. Hi, Tushar, visiting fellow at ORF and a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, Australia. My question is to Ambassador Shankar. For the past 1 decade, we've been hearing about China's economic and security belligerence in the region, which has somewhat made us closer to the US, forming quasi-strategic alignment with the US. And now when we see US belligerence towards India, we have been moving closer to China. So what is it? Is it a strategic autonomy that India talks about? Or is it a tactical temporary choices that India is practicing? Or is there a perhaps lack of vision and framework in Indian foreign policy?
Well, I would... Sorry, we are taking
Thank
questions.
you. Please proceed. Let's start with you.
I would say that for India, firstly, we are not strategically aligned with the US. We are a strategic partner of the US. And we therefore participate in other organizations also, apart from the Quad and the bilateral organizations we have with the US. We also participate in the SCO, in BRICS. So it's a variable geometry, if you would call it, of international cooperation. It's not only in one direction. We call this multi-alignment or strategic autonomy, basically being that we should determine how we develop our relations with the great powers. Clearly, of course, we had a good relationship with the US because it's our largest economic partner, largest source of technology, largest source of finance for India. And of course, the US was also seen as a key balancer in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, we had a good relationship with Russia, particularly in the defense and strategic sectors. The economic relationship was thin, but now we are buying energy from Russia as European energy resources, which Russia had committed to, have been freed. Still, it's a one-way relationship economically because we are not selling very much to Russia. The same holds true of China. There's been a lack of trust since Chinese military intrusions along the border in Ladakh. Both countries have made an effort to try to have disengagement along those friction points. This process was completed in October 24, and now we are talking about de-escalation. India would like to see a reduction of troops. There are 50,000 troops eyeball to eyeball on the border in this sector. So with China, it has to be a step-by-step process. It can't be that overnight we go from, a level of distrust to suddenly embracing each other. What you can say is that both countries are taking pragmatic steps to try to rebuild trust. From India's point of view, it would also be important to reinstate or develop new confidence-building measures on the border, which were violated. They had held the peace. There were agreements, 2-3 agreements. These had held the peace along the border for about 2 decades and were violated when Chinese troops came in. So I think what India is doing is now, in response to the Trump administration's unpredictability, unreliability, and capriciousness, if you will, in the entire relationship, we are trying or seeking a rebalance of our relationship with the great powers, not a disruption in our relationship with the United States, but reducing over-dependence on a single partner. So some rebalancing, but a lot is going to depend on how the US plays this in future. Are they going to look at a more, a more cooperative way of finding a solution, which doesn't only look at one side, that is the US prevailing, but more in terms of seeing what can be done to meet our concerns as well. So the way India is going to play it in future is going to be also dependent on how the US plays it in future.
Thank you. Dr. Kireva, please, the question on Central Asia.
Thank you so much for the question. So on Central Asia, I guess Russia and China as great powers, they have always had interests which have been quite close, but also different interests, meaning there has always been cooperation and competition, both of them between Russia and China and Central Asia. In terms of importance, of course, Central Asia is very important for Russia in many ways. And well, as we can see, probably in terms of influence, we can probably divide it into several spheres due to the developments. At first, we actually do not really see China trying to replace Russia as a security net provider to Central Asian states. So apart from the issues connected with the stability on China's border and the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan and the Afghanistan question, apart from that, we actually do not see China trying to replace Russia here or having some influence on Russia's positions on Central Asia. I guess in this sphere, Russia's positions are still very strong. In terms of economics, Russia's positions have, of course, generally been smaller than Chinese one for many years already, even prior to the Ukrainian conflict. And here, Russia still does have its economic influence. The problem, of course, for Russian companies now is that they do not have lots of finance to finance new projects. And here we can see probably that that's why they're not that active as their Chinese counterparts. Probably one areas of difference, which clearly we can see now, is that Russia and China want to develop different logistic and trade routes in regards to Central Asia. So China is clearly interested in developing the Trans-Asian corridor, which would actually help it to transit goods, to use Central Asia to transit goods to Europe by passing Russia. So this is something that has been happening since 2022. And of course, the most recent example has been the start of construction works on the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railroad. At the same time, Russia has taken really great interest in north-south economic route, north-south transport corridor, and is keen to develop more logistics and trade with India and this part of transport routes. So I guess here the interests are somewhat different. I would point it out as somewhere where there is some skepticism about the convergence. But generally, there's also very good understanding that simply Russian companies now do not have as much money as their Chinese counterparts. So while Russian business still holds some economic positions, it is not ready to compete much for new projects, I would say like this.
Thank you, Dr. Chong. The question on Arctic.
In terms of the Arctic, I think I can only add on to what Professor Kirieva has just said, in the sense that I think there's a strong, lopsided dependence here. China obviously wishes to extend an unconventional trade route, right, across the Arctic to Europe. And I think this is part of this unusual dimension that perhaps we don't have time to talk about. The European dimension in China's strategy in the era of Trump 2.0. Apparently, and as Ambassador Shankar has pointed out, and others as well, Europe is playing a very different game, all right, from Trump. While it is not on the same page with China on human rights and various other conflict issues, the Europeans have shown a certain pragmatic flexibility in dealing with China. And I think that this is where the Arctic comes in. China wishes to expedite, once the ice melts sufficiently, a very regular shipping freight service across the Arctic with Russia's cooperation, of course. And on the military front, I suspect, again, I'm not a deep military expert, it could be a way for Chinese ships, all right, to monitor US telemetry data, since the Arctic maritime routes pass near sensitive US missile installations in North America. So I think there's also that angle. On top of that, China could also, if Russia is willing to go that far, allow the stationing, whether permanent or temporary, of Chinese listening assets in relation to military communications in North America. Because you have to understand, the Arctic is a very strategic location on the globe in the era of satellites and intercontinental ballistic missiles. So whatever you can listen in terms of military chatter gives you some degree of insight into US operational doctrine, as well as, in the extreme case, early warning should there be an undeclared missile launch and so on and so forth. And I think in the long term, it is also China's strategy to maximize its position in the wake of the economic turbulence started by Trump 2.0, to bolster its special and advantageous position across any number of maritime routes and in the energy sector. And I can't improve on what Professor Kirieva has elaborated on in this session. And I think, the point of view from Moscow is probably to make sure that over time things get less unbalanced. But again, if you look at China's almost insatiable energy needs, it will work with whoever is willing to work with it to expedite new energy sources.
Excuse me. Yeah, if I may add one thing I have forgotten to say
Sure.
very quickly, sorry. Yeah, I forgot to say that the major thing that probably, even regarding this competition, which does exist, cooperation for Russia and China made it much, much stronger. And Russia and China have actually made lots of efforts to make more cooperation in Central Asia rather than competition. And I think in terms of economics specifically, Russia benefits from Central Asian economies developing and from regional stability. So China is one of the major Chinese investment, Chinese contracts are one of the major sources of Central Asian economic development. So in this regard, of course, Russia welcomes that. And making the region more stable is Russia's paramount interest. So here, Russia also welcomes Chinese contribution.
Thank you. It's an important note. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so let's take the last round of questions. 3 questions, please, from the audience. Don't forget to identify yourself and also, please.
Thank you so much. It's a really wonderful insight. My question is from Meera Shankar ma'am. Ma'am, you have pointed out China has leverage on rare earth minerals. That is why they are able to retaliate USA. But in case of India, we are facing 50% tariff from USA. So do you think that India should transition from service-driven economy to product-driven economy, something that cannot be substituted in the global market? For example, India is very good at designing, semiconductor design. Should it be built as a strategic product so that we can also retaliate in the international relation? Thank you.
Just a moment. Let's take other questions.
Hi, good evening to all of you. Jai Hind. I am retired Major Dasmana, and I'm founder of Center of International Futures. My question is with Ambassador Shankar. I just wanted to understand, I mean, we are discussing all the things, but still when we see the market, it's stable. Whether we talk about Dow Jones or we talk about Hang Seng. I mean, Hang Seng is always unpredictable. It's very difficult to get the real insights. But then how do you perceive all these geopolitical dynamics influencing the economics, the market per se? Because when we see the last 6 months, everything is stable. One odd day, it is volatile because of the things. Because the smaller nations like today, Nepal is being unrest, then Japan has been unrest. So all these dynamics. And secondly, how do you perceive this entire narrative warfare again being created by Trump? Has he been able to fulfill any promises, be it stopping the war of Ukraine or talking about the immigration policy? And now he's playing again the gunboat policy with the Caribbean. So how do you perceive whether Trump is able to keep up to his promises? And second, the economics part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. And one last question.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful insights. My question, I am Srijan Dubey, a student of Indian School of Public Policy. My question is directed to Madam Ambassador. My question is, when you were talking about borders and India building border infrastructure, India does not follow a written policy on dual-use infrastructure, but China does. Is it just because of economic constraints, or is there any specific policy reason for that, not following a written document for that? Okay. Thank you.
Ambassador Shankar, you seem to be the star of the show. Please, could you respond to all these 3 questions?
First was whether we should shift towards, a product economy so that we also build leverage in future in the event of efforts to pressurize us. I would say we need to build an economy which is on 3 legs, not just agriculture and services, but also manufacturing, because you need it, A, to provide jobs. Unemployment is a big issue in India at present. And as more people get out of the rural economy, you will need to have jobs which can absorb those who are not so well educated. That will be in manufacturing. So I think it's not just to build leverage, but for our own economic prosperity that we need to emphasize manufacturing. And yes, in services too, we have been providing, really just doing services, but we could also have software products, which we are really not doing at present. I think we need to broad base our economy. That's in response to your question. And overall grow it to a point where, you have sufficient capability to stand on your own. With regard to your question, which was about whether Trump has been able to fulfill his promises and the markets are stable. Why are the markets stable in the midst of all this? So one is that, the US economy was doing quite well under Biden. It was a robust economy that he handed over to Trump, both in terms of growth, in terms of low unemployment, perhaps the lowest levels that the US has seen in a long, long while, and inflation, which was the main concern of consumers, had also begun to reduce, coming down from a high of over 9% to over 2-point-something%. So he handed Trump a pretty robust economy. It's going to take a while before he can wreck it. So that really is carrying on. With regard to the tariffs and other measures having an impact on the US economy, see, a lot of countries have front-loaded shipments to the US in anticipation of tariffs, and these have been warehoused in the US. So there's surplus capacity available right now to tide over for a couple of months. But after that, you're going to see the impact of the tariffs kick in, and already you're seeing an increase in unemployment. So the levels of new jobs being created is much less than anticipated. So President Trump has fired the head of the agency which provided the data. Secondly, inflation has begun to rise, not very fast, but still it's begun to rise. So whether the Federal Reserve will be able to reduce interest rates is a question mark. With regard to other promises on immigration, I think he has delivered in a nasty way. And it's not just staunching the flow of immigrants, but also demonstrating humiliation, to immigrants who have come in. So people have been sent in chains and so on, in military aircraft. But the fact is that inflows of immigrants across the southern border, the Mexican border, have come down quite dramatically. So you could say, yes, he has delivered on immigration, on staunching the flows of immigration. On deportation, he's not actually even deporting at the level that Obama did. So it's more drama, but let's see. It's an ongoing program, and he has given more resources to border security agencies, to agencies like the Customs and ICE, to strengthen enforcement. On tariffs, he has deals with many countries where they have accepted totally one-sided agreements, including in Southeast Asia, Vietnam and so on, or in Europe or even Japan. Many of US's partners have grudgingly, not very willingly, have grudgingly accepted one-sided agreements because that's the reality of the US economy. But overall, let's see how it goes. He is usurping executive power from the Congress. The courts are striking down many of his decisions, but the Supreme Court is leaning towards enabling him. So when it goes in appeal, you don't know what the result is going to be. Overall, it's too early to say. His own constituency is still quite happy with him, though approval ratings have come down, I think, from 80 to 60 or something in his constituency. And overall, his approval ratings may be between 38 and 40 8%. So they've come down quite dramatically. But the Democrats are at 28%. So, the opposition still has to get its act together. Let's see.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sure there are still plenty of questions to be discussed, both regarding Russia-China relationship and global situation at large. On this note, I would like to first thank our online speakers for joining us despite technical constraints, despite time difference. It's lunchtime in Moscow, it's dinner time in Singapore. So thank you so much for being with us. I would like to thank our panelists, Ambassador Shankar, Kalpit Mankikar, for bringing up brilliant perspectives on Russia-China relations, an Indian angle, and also the US and European angles. And I would like to thank all of you for joining our events and hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.